Hi everyone, how's it going? Are we all surviving? It's scary times. It's really awful everything that's going on, and I was a bit uncertain about what do I really want to tempt myself with all of these interesting sounding new books that are being published because this is also prime time for book prize season. I have lots of stacks of books that have been nominated for book prizes that I really want to read. But then, I might be spending a lot more time inside, as a lot of us might be spending a lot more time inside, confined by ourselves. And so the more books, the better at this time of year. The sort of joke that keeps going around amongst the bookish community is, well, I've been preparing for self-confinement for decades because I have hundreds and hundreds of books on my shelves that I can get to that, is enough for 5 lifetimes. And I have the same thing. So I sort of think the more books, the better. So I want to talk about new books that are being published in March that I'm really excited about and that publishers have kindly sent me. I'm sent a lot of books, but these are just the ones that I'm really interested in reading that if, given an infinite amount of time, which I might have, I would want to read. So I'm going to talk about all of these. But first, there's a special book that I want to talk about. Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawlor, which was one of my favorite books from last year and which has just come out in paperback. And I was kindly sent the paperback edition of this along with a very special cap, which I was so excited about when I saw they posted pictures, the publisher posted pictures of this online, and both me and Garth Greenwell were responded to this on Twitter and were like, I need to have one of these caps because it is so cool and I just love it. And so I wrote to them and asked them, I barely ever write to publishers asking for things, but I was like, I'd really love one of these caps, and they were like, don't worry, we're sending you one already. So I've got one. Feels so cool, and I just love this novel so much about a young man in the 1990s who changes genders over time and all the complications of that, sort of modern day Orlando story. I've talked about this book a lot, so I just love this book. And now I've gone and messed up my hair. Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This is a novel about a woman who's been going through a really rough time. She's had the breakup of an affair, a really passionate affair, and her mother has died. And she's just trying to get through it by writing a novel. But then she meets 2 very different men who are people she could possibly have long-term relationships with. And it's about her struggle trying to decide who she wants to be with, as well as struggling with these issues of grief. Now that sounds quite sort of fluffy or sort of silly romance, but there are blurbs on this by Elizabeth Strout and Madeline Miller, who are both writers that I really love, and so I sort of trust their opinion, and it's really nice that this sort of matches my lovely daffodils that I have in the background. Come Again by Robert Webb. This is another novel about relationships, and it's written by an actor, Robert Webb, who, if you've never seen the TV show Peep Show, I love that series. It's so hilarious and funny. And Robert Webb has written a memoir before, which was supposed to be really great and which I meant to read, but just didn't get around to. And this is his debut novel. So the novel is about a couple who are together for 28 years and have a really close, intimate relationship. And then one of the pair dies at a sort of relatively early age. And so then the surviving partner, they go to sleep and they wake up and it's back to the start of their relationship. So there's sort of like a reboot, but with the knowledge that this long-term romance is going to end in a tragic way, and so it's sort of looking at the consequences of how do you deal with that if you know that your relationship only is going to have a limited time span, even though it's quite a long time span. It's sort of all the issues to do with that, which is quite an interesting premise for a novel. Next, I have a big chunky historical novel, and that's The Land Beyond the Sea by Sharon Penman. And I've been talking recently about reading Wolf Hall and Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell series, and since I've been really enjoying it, I've wondering if I should read some more historical fiction, and I think this sounds quite interesting. So it's the year is 1172, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem has been taken over forcefully by men of the First Crusade, and it's been taken from people called the Saracens. And the Saracens want to take back their kingdom. So it's about the battle and the struggle between the leader of the Saracens fighting against the new leader of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so I'm wondering if I want to get sort of lost in more historical epics like this. And this is over almost 700 pages long. So I've never read this writer before. If you've ever read her, let me know your thoughts on her, if you think she might be slightly comparable to Hilary Mantel. Kingdomtide by Rye Curtis. This is a novel about a very old woman who gets lost in the wilderness and who is just sort of struggling to survive by herself out in the wilderness. And majority of people believe that she must have just died out there because she's so old, but there's a park ranger who has a very troubled life, but who believes that this older woman might still be alive, and so is leading a search party for her. So it's sort of the story is about the search for her, as well as this older woman's struggle in the wilderness, which sounds like a really interesting premise. Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones. This has such a beautiful cover. Now, I believe this novel was first published a few years ago in America, but obviously Tayari Jones won the Women's Prize last year, and so the publisher is now bringing out some of her back catalog, because I think her novel that won last year was her first novel to be published in the UK. So now more of her work is being published here, and this is just so beautiful. And so this is the story about a man who was a bigamist and had two different families. One of them was he lived out in the open with them, and then he had a secret family. And it's about he had a daughter in each of these different marriages that he was maintaining at the same time, and how the daughters meet and the whole struggle, emotional complexity of that whole situation, which is obviously a very fraught situation. Finding Clara by Anika Scott. This is a historical novel set in Germany several years after the end of the Second World War, and it's looking at the perspective of a number of different Germans and the complexity of issues to do with whether they were complicit with the Nazis or were sort of secretly fighting against them, because obviously a lot of the citizens at the time might not have agreed with what the Nazis were doing, but felt like they had to go along with them. And so it's all about the complexities of that. Jack and Beth by Sara Butler. This is a novel about an elderly couple who have been together for a really long time and who still live independently together, but their son, who's sort of concerned about their long-term welfare, thinks that they should move into a home with assisted care, and but they want to remain independent. So it's about the whole struggles of that. Next, I have a whole group of books by Irish writers, and I really love Irish writing, and I know that recently there's been a sort of Irish readathon going on in the bookish community. I mean, there's always these sort of different read-alongs that have been going along, and I've been wanting to join in with it, but because I've been reading so many books that have been listed for prizes, I felt like I haven't really really been able to, although I have just read Anne Wright's most recent novel, Actress, which is longlisted for the Women's Prize. But yeah, here's a number of other books by Irish authors that have been being published and or just been published this month that I would like to read as well. So the first is Bina by Anakana Schofield. Who's a really interesting writer. I read one of her previous books, and this is supposed to be pronounced Bina, and it's about a woman who is just sort of fed up with life and is ready to tell her own story, and she does so by writing short snippets on the backs of envelopes. So I think the text is meant to be all these sort of short snippets of her thoughts and impressions and memories and her sort of ranting about a number of things, which I think sounds quite fun. The Weight of Love by Hilary Fannin. This is Fannin's debut novel. She's previously published a memoir, but this is her first novel. And so it's the story of Robin and Ruth, who are a couple that want to get married. It starts in the 1990s, and so Robin introduces his partner Ruth to his best friend Joseph. And Ruth and Joseph really hit it off and have an affair with each other. But then it flashes forward to many years later when Robin and Ruth have, in fact, got married, but how they're sort of haunted by this affair which happened between his wife and his best friend. So about the messy emotional complications of all of that. The Butchers by Ruth Gilligan. Now, I loved this author's previous novel, Ninefolds Make a Paper Swan. You may remember I talked a lot about it at the time in the year that it came out. And this novel it takes as its premise a photograph which is hung in an art gallery where you can see in the photograph a man is hung on a butcher's hook. And sort of from this photograph, there's a whole story about it, about history and traditions in Ireland of the butchery of cows and sort of old traditions. But then it's also about the current times when mad cow disease is sort of spreading across the country and a lot of cows needed to be executed. And so it goes into the story of all that in the current day, but also it's, I think, meant to be about the sort of uneasy relationship between the past and present in Ireland and that whole tension. So yeah, I'm very keen to read her new novel. Handiwork by Sara Baume. This is another author where I've loved her previous two books that I've read by her, and this is actually a nonfiction book. It's her first nonfiction book that she's published, and she's a visual artist as well as a writer, and so this is a book about the creative process, and she's such a interesting, reflective writer, sort of about sort of art and the process of making art. So it feels really natural that she would write and publish a book like this, and I'm so curious to read it. You Have to Make Your Own Fun Around Here by Frances Macken. This is a novel about a group of girls in a very small town in Ireland who have a very tight-knit friendship, but that's sort of disrupted when a new girl moves to their very small town from Dublin. So it's about the tensions between sort of city life and country life, and yeah, the struggles of young friendship. And finally, out of this group of Irish books is one that I'm hugely excited about, which is A Thousand Moons by Sebastian Barry. So this is actually a sequel to his novel Days Without End, which you may remember I had a lot of opinions on this book. I mean, I loved this novel, but I had a lot of opinions about the way it was published, and I made a whole video about that previously, which I'll link below if you want to see. But this novel carries on from that story where Thomas and John were soldiers in America during the American Civil War, and they, during the story of this novel, they adopt a young Native American girl who is an orphan. And so this is the story of that orphan named Winona, and it follows, her story and her life. And I think I've heard that it's really great, and I mean all of his novels are really great. So yes, I'm very keen to read this sequel. On Terrorism by Tahar Ben Jelloun. This is a non-fiction book where the author has very frank conversations with his daughter about the issue of terrorism and the history of terrorism, and takes this at starting point, her ill-defined fears about this whole issue. And it's looking at the history of Islam's place in the modern world and in relationship with Islamic terrorism. And so it deals with all these issues in a very frank and open way. And I love that it takes as its starting point, these conversations between a father and daughter, because it's the way of talking about all these issues in a very open way. Then I have a couple books of poetry, and I've said how I've been wanting to read more poetry this year, and I didn't do so well with that over the past month. So I want to get on and read some more poetry. So first there's Zonal by Dawn Patterson, and these are poems which are based in autobiography, but use as a method, kind of science fiction sort of way of looking at the world, and it takes as its basis episodes of The Twilight Zone. So I think it sort of deals with this sort of autobiographical content in quite a humorous and playful way. Then there's a new collection by Simon Armitage, which also is quite autobiographical, and that these are all poems which are based in the town of Marsden. It's a really beautiful cover, and that's the town which the author comes from. So it's his reflections on his town. And I heard the author read a section of this, and it was so funny. He reads a section about how he goes back to his hometown, and there's a tour being given about Simon Armitage, and it's called the Simon Armitage Tour. And to join this tour, but not influence how the tour is being run, he wears a disguise, and so he sort of goes undercover, but finds that the tour is very ill-attended. There's only a few people on it, and those people aren't really all that interested in him, and the guide himself isn't really that interested in the poet. So it's taken a very funny sort of wry look at his own fame, because he's one of Britain's best known poets. It's his sort of taking a funny look at that while also reflecting on his childhood birthplace. Box Hill by Adam Mars Jones, and this is the first time Adam Mars Jones has published a novel in almost 10 years, and it's quite interesting that his previous books are quite long. His last novels were very extensive, but this is very slight. So it's sort of interesting that after all this time, he's produced this very slight novel, and the premise of it is fantastic. So it's about a love affair between two bikers during the 1980s, and so it's about that whole underground culture of bikers, but a sort of subculture within a subculture of that is the sort of gay culture of that. And so I'm so excited to read this. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for by Jen Kaleha. This is a book of short stories by an author, but she's also a translator. You may remember last year the Booker International Prize, one of the shortlisted novels was The Pine Islands by Marion Porshman, and that was translated by Jen Kaleha. And one of these short stories is about a writer who has been nominated for the Prize of Prizes prize. And so I think it's taking a slightly humorous look at the whole literary prize culture. So I'll be really interested to read that short story. But a lot of these stories are about the motivations, hidden motivations behind our desires. And so I'll be really interested to read these stories. Business as Usual by Jane Oliver and Anne Stafford. So this is a reprint of a novel which was first published in the 1930s, and it's about a young Scottish woman who moves to London London and wants to make a life for herself here. And she gets a job working at a department store called Everyman's in the novel, but it's a really thinly veiled portrait of the famous department store Selfridges. And so it's sort of a depiction of Selfridges at that time, but also about the struggles of young people trying to make working class people trying to make a living for themselves during this period of history. And yeah, I think it's give a really interesting look at British culture through the lens of a department store. The Secret Diaries of Miss Anne Lister. So this is actually the second volume of Diaries by this woman from the early 1800s who was a businesswoman and an industrialist, but she was also a lesbian, and she kept secret diaries, which she wrote in code because obviously she didn't want her exploits to be made public. But the writer Helena Whitbread has translated these coded diaries and has published them. And so, yeah, this is the second volume of that. So obviously such a fascinating secret history that's sort of been uncovered. And the first volume was taken as the basis of a TV show called Gentleman Jack, made about this really fascinating woman's life. And so these diaries follow Anne Lister as she travels to Paris and has an affair with a woman there. So yeah, so fascinating. And finally, I have the new novel by Evie Wilde called The Bass Rock. And I already talked about this with Anna when we were talking about our speculating what might be on the Women's Prize long list. And this didn't make it to the long list, but it's a novel that I'm so excited about reading as I was talking about. I think she's such a fascinating writer. So this novel is about 3 different women over the course of a number of centuries, but all centered around the same place where there's this group of rocks jutting out from the Scottish seas, and how people, their lives sort of interact with this particular location. And so, yeah, she has such an interesting narrative style. I'm so curious to see how she handles time and the different personalities of these women over this long period of time. So I'm so excited about this. So yeah, so that is a lot of books that I talked about. But like I said, we might all be stuck inside for a long time. So yeah, it's good to have a lot of reading material for all of this. So yeah, like always, let me know in the comments below which of these books you're most interested in, which you would be keen to read. And if you've read any of them, let me know your thoughts on them. So thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Bye, everyone.